The stories. What happened inside this mountain lodge will shock you. The guest log from that mountain lodge still sits in a plastic evidence sleeve with one page glued to another. Dispatch records show a routine welfare check, then a second call minutes later that changed everything. In early October of 2011, Tegan Rourke was 33 and worked as a county building inspector. That morning, Tegan planned to recheck a roof repair on a remote lodge above a winding forest road. The lodge stayed open year-round, but the owner only kept staff there on busy weekends. Tegan had done permits there before, and the place always felt quiet but harmless. The weather was clear, and the drive up took just under 2 hours from the county offices downtown. Tegan's county truck climbed through pine stands and bare rock, and the radio kept fading in and out. A printed work order sat on the passenger seat, with a note about leaks over the dining hall. Tegan expected a quick walkthrough, a few photos, and a signature from whoever was on site. At the turnoff, the lodge sign leaned slightly, and the gravel lot had only one vehicle parked. It was an older SUV with an out-of-state plate, and its driver window was cracked open. Tegan noted it in a small notebook because parked vehicles mattered in a rural inspection log. The lodge itself was a long timber building with a stone chimney and tall windows facing the slope. Tegan knocked at the front doors and waited, then tried again with a little more force. No one answered, and the doors were locked, which was unusual during posted open hours. Tegan walked around to the side entrance near the kitchen, where staff usually came and went. That door was also locked, but the deadbolt was not fully seated like it had been rushed. Tegan called the owner's number from the permit file, and it went to voicemail after 4 rings. A text message sent, then stayed unread, and Tegan felt the first small pinch of worry. County rules allowed an exterior inspection without entry, but the leak note required a look inside. Tegan radioed the office, reported no contact, and said a second attempt would be made shortly. Tegan moved under the eaves and checked the roof line from the ground with binoculars. The shingles looked new over one section, and a gutter joint had been patched with sloppy sealant. A faint drip line stained the siding, and Tegan snapped photos with a work phone. Then a sound came from inside, a single thud that carried through the front windows. Tegan froze, listening, and heard nothing else for several seconds after that heavy impact. The lodge sat too far from neighbors for casual foot traffic, and no wind moved the doors. Tegan tried the front doors again, and this time the right door shifted a half-inch. It had been locked before, but now the latch gave slightly, like something inside pressed against it. Tegan stepped back and decided not to force entry, because welfare checks were not the county job. Still, the odd shift in the door made leaving feel wrong, like ignoring a smoke smell. Tegan called the sheriff dispatch line and requested a deputy to check the building. The call log later showed Tegan used calm language, but the dispatcher noted concern about possible injury. While waiting, Tegan walked back toward the SUV to see if someone was nearby in the lot. The SUV keys were not visible, and the seats were empty, but a paper map lay open on the dash. A small badge clip hung from the rearview mirror, the kind used for conferences or guided tours. Tegan could not read the name through the glass, but the plastic sleeve looked freshly printed. Tegan stood by the county truck and watched the lodge windows, expecting movement in the curtains. Nothing shifted, and the silence started to feel staged, like a room waiting for a cue. A second thud came, softer this time, followed by a faint scrape that lasted 2 seconds. Tegan raised the phone to record audio, then stopped, unsure if that would help later. Deputy Marlowe Kincaid arrived about 20 minutes later, alone in a marked unit. Marlowe was 41 and had worked patrol in the county for 14 years. He greeted Tegan, took in the locked lodge and the lone SUV, and asked what happened so far. Tegan explained the door shift and the sounds, then handed over the permit file contact number. Marlowe tried the front entrance, found the same slight give, and tested the handle carefully. The door opened 2 inches, then stuck, as if something heavy pressed it from the other side. Marlowe called out, "Sheriff's office! Anyone inside?" and waited for an answer that never came. He motioned Tegan to stay back, then reached around the gap with a flashlight. The beam caught a strip of carpet near the threshold, darkened by something that looked wet. Marlowe's posture changed, and he pushed the door harder, but it still would not swing fully. He stepped aside, drew a small pry bar from his kit, and worked the latch without splintering wood. The door gave another few inches, and the smell hit them both, sharp and sour like old water and metal. Marlowe backed out and called dispatch again, requesting a second unit and medical standby. The dispatch log reportedly shows his tone shifted from routine to urgent within that sentence. He then circled to the kitchen door, found it partially unseated, and eased it open with his shoulder. That entrance opened cleanly, and the two of them stepped into a dim hallway lined with framed photos. The lodge was colder inside than it should have been, like the heat had been off for hours. A small radio played faintly in the kitchen, but the volume was low, almost like it was meant to hide. Marlowe followed the sound toward the dining hall, moving slow and keeping Tegan behind him. The floorboards creaked, and a hanging light swayed slightly, though no air seemed to move. At the dining hall doorway, something blocked the opening from the far side. It was a chair tipped on its side, wedged against the door like a crude barricade. Marlowe pushed it away with his boot, and the doorway cleared enough to see the room. The tables were set for breakfast, but no food sat out, and the place looked paused mid-routine. Near the fireplace, a man lay on his back with one arm bent under him at an awkward angle. He wore a lodge, staff polo, and his face had bruising around one eye, older than a few minutes. Marlowe checked for response from a safe distance, then moved in and felt for a pulse. The man was cold, and Marlowe looked down at the floor beside him, where dried streaks ran toward the entry. Tegan stood in the doorway, trying not to stare, and focused on small details to stay steady. A lodge keyring lay near the man's hand, and one key was snapped clean in half. A thin line of clear fishing wire ran from the chair at the doorway to a table leg. It was tied tight, and Tegan saw it only because the flashlight glare caught its sheen. Marlowe followed the wire with his eyes, then cut it with a pocket knife to remove tension. He told Tegan to step back into the hallway, and Tegan did without arguing. He radioed dispatch again, and his short words suggested a deceased person and a possible scene. The radio response crackled, and for a moment, Tegan could not understand any of it through the static. While waiting for backup, Marlowe did a slow sweep without touching anything else. He checked the front entrance from inside and found the reason it would not open. A heavy rolling cart from the kitchen had been shoved against it, with towels stuffed under its wheels. The cart was positioned with care, like someone wanted the door to move just enough to tempt entry. The lodge office sat behind the front desk, and Marlowe could see light under its door. He tested the knob, found it locked, then noticed a second strand of wire at ankle height. That wire ran from the office door handle to a wall hook, like a tension trap. He stepped over it and stayed clear, then called out again to announce his presence. No one answered from the office, but a printer clicked once, then hummed as if waking. The sound was small, yet it made Tegan's stomach tighten, because it implied someone had been there. Marlowe kept his weapon holstered and used a mirror tool to look around the door edge. He saw no movement, then waited, like he was giving a hidden person time to make a choice. Backup arrived, along with a medic unit that stopped short when the scene was explained. Deputy Arden Sola joined Marlowe, and together they secured the lodge and kept Tegan outside. Tegan sat on a stone bench by the entrance, hands on knees, watching steam rise from their breath. From that spot, Tegan noticed something odd about the SUV. The rear hatch was not fully latched. When Arden checked the SUV, she did not open it right away, but photographed the gap first. Inside the hatch, a duffel bag sat open with folders, a portable recorder, and extra badge clips. The badges all carried the lodge name, with a line that read, Guest Services Volunteer Weekend. None of the badges had a photo, only a blank square and a printed first name that looked generic. Arden set the bag aside as possible evidence and closed the hatch gently, leaving it for investigators. Detectives arrived later that afternoon, and the lodge became a sealed scene with tape and logs. Tegan gave a formal statement, repeating details, and was asked twice about the fishing wire. Tegan described where it was tied and how it caught the flashlight glare, and the detective wrote carefully. They also asked about the earlier thuds, and Tegan admitted the second scrape sounded like furniture moving. The detectives found another staff member in an upstairs room, alive but disoriented and dehydrated. She was named Lorna Vess, 36, and worked as a front desk clerk during weekends. Lorna reportedly said she had been locked in the room and her phone had been taken. She remembered arguing with someone she thought was a guest, then a sting in her neck, then darkness. In the office, investigators found a laptop open to a guest reservation list. Several names were typed in, then deleted, then typed again, like someone kept changing the plan. A printed sheet sat in the printer tray, warm to the touch, listing check-in times for people who never arrived. The times were spaced exactly 15 minutes apart, and each entry used the same handwriting style in the notes field. They also recovered an audio recorder under the front desk, still running when it was found. The file timestamp matched the morning of the welfare check, according to later reports. It captured faint footsteps, the scrape of a cart, and a voice whispering a phrase twice. The phrase was hard to make out, but analysts later suggested it sounded like, "Keep them outside." Tegan was asked to review photos of the dining hall layout from earlier permit visits. Tegan noticed the tables were arranged differently than normal, leaving clear paths between doorways. The fireplace tools had been moved to the far wall, neatly lined up like they were counted. A single chair sat facing the front desk, centered, as if someone wanted a person to sit there. It was the kind of staging that looked normal until someone pointed out how deliberate it was. The dead man was identified as a seasonal employee hired 3 weeks earlier. His employment file listed only a local mailing address and a prepaid phone number. Investigators could not confirm prior work references, and the ID copy looked unusually clean. The medical examiner later ruled the death a homicide caused by blunt force trauma and delayed help. The report noted older bruises, suggesting the man had been struck earlier, then moved. Lorna, once stabilized, gave more details in a second interview that detectives treated as key. She recalled a guest who arrived the night before, claiming the lodge needed a safety inspection. He wore a lanyard badge that looked official, and he spoke with confident, practiced calm. He asked where the security cameras recorded and whether the front doors could be opened from inside. When Lorna questioned the request, he smiled and said, "It's a drill. The owner knows." That line sounded harmless in the moment, but it became important once detectives checked the owner's story. The owner insisted no drill was planned and no outside safety contractor had been hired. Phone records showed the owner received missed calls, but none were returned until late afternoon. He also admitted he rarely checked the lodge on weekdays, and he trusted staff to handle small issues. That gap in oversight gave someone space to run a plan without interruption. The biggest break came from the guest services volunteer badges found in the SUV. A detective called the lodge booking vendor and asked about the volunteer weekend program. The vendor said no such event existed, and the lodge had never used that wording in promotions. The badge design, however, matched a template used by a nearby conference center. It was a generic print layout, the kind anyone could buy online and customize in minutes. Investigators then pulled archived security footage from a gas station down the mountain. The footage reportedly showed the older SUV arriving the previous evening, then leaving briefly, then returning. A man in a ball cap carried a rolling cart cover, like the ones used for banquet linens. He moved with familiarity, like he knew exactly what tools he needed and where to place them. He also wore a lanyard, and the badge swung forward once, showing a blank square where a photo belonged. The twist did not come from a hidden identity reveal, but from a detail Tegan almost dismissed. During the first statement, Tegan mentioned the front door shifting, as if something pressed it. A detective later asked Tegan to walk through that moment again, step by step, without guessing. Tegan realized the door shift happened after the first thud, not before, which meant timing mattered. It suggested someone moved the cart to create the tempting gap only after hearing Tegan outside. That led detectives back to the audio recorder under the front desk. They enhanced the section between the thud and the door shift, filtering out the radio static. A clearer sound emerged, the rolling squeak of rubber wheels, followed by a breathy whisper. The phrase was not "keep them outside" after all, it was "get them outside," repeated with urgency. It sounded like a command to someone else, not a reminder to self. From there, the theory shifted in a way that surprised even the investigators on the case. They had assumed a lone intruder staged traps to prevent entry, then escaped out a back route. Instead, the evidence pointed to two people, one inside controlling access, another upstairs managing Lorna. The dead employee likely resisted, got injured, and became a problem to move out of sight. The person at the front desk then tried to lure an outsider in, but keep them from seeing too much. The chair barricade and fishing wire were not meant to harm an intruder. They were meant to slow them down, trip them lightly, and force them to look at the floor. If someone stumbled, they would focus on their footing, not on the office door or the front desk area. The rolling cart at the front door was positioned to let the latch click, making it seem unlocked. That tiny invitation would draw a person to the wrong entrance, while the real exit stayed clear elsewhere. A second exit did exist, but it was not a secret tunnel or anything dramatic. It was the service stairwell that led to a ground-level storage door behind the lodge. That door had no alarm contact, because it was listed as an interior-only access in old plans. Tegan's permit photos from years earlier showed the door, but no one had updated the security list. The person who planned this had likely studied those plans or worked a similar building before. In the weeks that followed, the case did not end with a neat arrest and a televised confession. Investigators identified a suspect connected to a string of small frauds involving fake inspections. Witness statements placed him near the lodge, and a partial fingerprint matched on a badge clip. Still, the second person remained unknown, and no clear motive beyond control and deception was proven. Official statements used careful language, noting the investigation remained open and evidence was incomplete. Tegan returned to the county office and filed the inspection as incomplete, with notes that felt unreal. For months after, Tegan kept replaying the moment the door shifted, like the building itself breathed. It was not a ghost story, and no one claimed anything supernatural happened in that lodge. It was just a plan, built from small choices, simple tools, and a confidence that nobody would look closely. Tegan learned that the scariest part was how ordinary everything looked until the pattern appeared. The stories. The unsettling truth about this church basement. The first dispatch note called it a welfare check, but the basement door was bolted from the outside. By dawn, the church had taped off its own hallway, and nobody could agree on what they heard. In a river town in the upper Midwest, the old brick church sat 1 block from the courthouse. It was the kind of place that hosted potlucks, weddings, and quiet funerals all year. On a humid Tuesday in late summer, a man named Teague Ralston showed up early. Teague was 36, and he worked as a municipal building inspector for the county. He planned to finish one routine inspection, then grab coffee before his afternoon meetings. The church had applied for a permit to replace a stair rail near the basement steps. Teague had signed off on similar work dozens of times, and he expected nothing unusual. The pastor met him at the side entrance, smiling like this was an easy win. Her name was MrBallen, and she looked tired under her neat hair. She apologized for the smell of paint, then said the contractor was running late. Teague asked for the basement access, since that was where the steps started. Maris led him down a narrow hallway, past a bulletin board and a locked office door. At the end, a heavy metal door sat under a faded exit sign. Maris reached for her keyring, then stopped and frowned at the latch. The padlock was already on, and it was snapped shut. Maris said, "That's not ours. We don't lock it like that." Teague leaned close and saw a fresh scratch in the metal near the staple. It looked like someone had forced the lock into place with a tool. He asked who had a key, and Maris shook her head too quickly. Teague didn't like surprises, especially around fire egress and public spaces. He told Maris he needed the lock removed, and he would note it in his report. Maris tried to laugh, then said, "Maybe the contractor did it for safety." Teague asked for the contractor's name, and she gave a company he recognized. He called the number from his phone, and it went to a generic voicemail prompt. A muffled thump came from the other side of the door. It wasn't loud, but it had weight, like a knee hitting a wall. Maris went still, then whispered, "Did you hear that?" Teague put his ear near the seam, and he heard a faint dragging sound. It lasted only a second, then there was silence again. Teague stepped back and asked if anyone was down there. Maris said the basement was empty, and her voice sounded practiced. Teague tried the handle anyway, and it didn't budge. He told Maris he was calling it in because a locked basement wasn't normal. Maris lifted her hands, then said, "Please, don't make a scene." Teague called the non-emergency line for the police department. He kept his voice calm, and he described the lock and the noise. The dispatcher asked if he saw smoke or immediate danger, and he said no. Then the dispatcher asked if anyone was missing, and Teague hesitated. Maris answered that nobody was missing, but she sounded irritated. The dispatcher said an officer would come by when available. Teague didn't love that, so he tried the door again, harder this time. The metal rattled, and the padlock held. Another thump came from inside, followed by what sounded like a quick breath. Teague looked at Maris, and she stared at the floor tiles. He told her he was going to step outside and find a tool. Maris said, "You can't break church property." Teague said, "Someone might be trapped. I'm not waiting." He walked out to his truck, grabbed a small bolt cutter, and headed back inside. He carried it like it was just another piece of work gear. Maris followed him, and her shoes squeaked on the tile. She said the church had an old fallout shelter room down there. Nothing more. Teague asked why a fallout room would need a fresh padlock. Maris said, "It's complicated. We just need time." Teague didn't answer because his focus had narrowed to the lock. He knelt, set the cutter jaws, and squeezed. The lock resisted, then snapped with a sharp crack. The door swung inward an inch, as if pressure had been holding it closed. A breath of air spilled out, sour and damp, like wet cardboard and old bleach. Teague pulled the door open and stepped into the stairwell. The light switch didn't work, so he used his phone flashlight. The steps were steep, and the handrail was new, still sticky with paint. Halfway down, he saw scuff marks on the wall, like heels had kicked during a struggle. At the bottom, the basement opened into a wide room with folding tables stacked neatly. Teague called out again, and his voice echoed off concrete. A soft whimper answered from behind a partition wall near the furnace room. He moved slowly, keeping his light low, and he saw a figure crouched by a pipe. It was a young man, late teens maybe, with wrists red and raw. Duct tape lay on the floor beside him, torn and dirty. The young man flinched when the light hit his face. He raised his hands and said, "Don't close it. Please don't close it." Teague said, "It's open. You're okay. What's your name?" The young man swallowed and said, "Kellen. Kellen Drex." His voice was hoarse, like he had been shouting for hours. Teague asked if anyone else was down there. Kellen shook his head, then pointed toward a storage closet. He said, "They moved the stuff," they said, "to keep quiet." Teague asked who, and Kellen's eyes darted upward toward the stairs. He said, "Church people. Not all, just some." Teague told him he was calling police again, and he did it immediately. This time, he said there was a restrained person in the basement. The dispatcher's tone changed, and she said officers were on the way. Teague stayed between Kellen and the stairs, watching the doorway like it might bite. Maris appeared at the top step, framed by the hallway light. She looked down and froze when she saw Kellen. Her face went pale, then her jaw tightened like she was forcing herself to breathe. She started down one step, then stopped, gripping the rail. Teague said, "Don't come closer, just wait upstairs." Maris said, "Kellen, what are you doing here?" Kellen didn't answer, and his shoulders shook with contained sobs. Teague watched Maris's hands, because they were trembling. She said, "This isn't what it looks like." Teague said, "It looks like someone locked him in." Maris backed up without another word. Teague heard her shoes retreat, then a door slam somewhere above. For a moment, the basement felt even colder, despite the humid air. Kellen whispered, "She's not the worst one." Teague asked who was, and Kellen stared at the concrete. 2 officers arrived within minutes, according to later timestamps in the logs. They came down cautiously, hands near their belts, lights sweeping the corners. Teague explained what happened, and Kellen repeated his name and age. He said he was 19, and he had come to talk to someone at the church. He claimed he had been in a counseling session, then told to wait downstairs. Kellen said he asked to leave, and someone blocked the stairs. He said there were voices, then tape, then the click of a lock. He couldn't name everyone, but he described one man with a heavy ring. He remembered the ring because it scratched his cheek when tape was pressed down. He also remembered a sweet chemical smell, like a cleaner or solvent. The officers took Kellen upstairs and sat him on a chair in the fellowship hall. They asked Teague to stay. Since he was a witness and the one who cut the lock, Teague sat at a table with a paper cup of water, hands still buzzing. A third officer walked through the building, checking rooms and doors. The basement door was now open, and a strip of tape marked it as a scene. Maris finally returned, with another person close behind her. It was a man in a suit jacket, older, broad-shouldered, and polished-looking. He introduced himself as the church administrator, Hollis Quaid. He asked why police were in his building, and his tone was offended. One officer said there was a report of unlawful restraint, and Hollis smiled tightly. Hollis said, "This is a misunderstanding. The young man is unstable." Kellen looked up at that, and his mouth opened in disbelief. He said, "I asked to leave? You told them to lock it." Hollis raised a hand and said, "Son, you were a danger to yourself." Kellen shook his head, and tears rolled down his cheeks. Teague watched Hollis, and he noticed something small. On Hollis's right hand, a thick ring glinted under the hall lights. It was silver, with a dark stone that looked almost black. Teague remembered Kellen's detail, and his stomach tightened again. He told the officer quietly about the ring description and the scratch detail. The officers asked Hollis to step aside, and they requested keys and records. Hollis said the church kept counseling notes confidential, protected by policy. The officer said policy wasn't the same as law, and he asked again. Maris stood behind Hollis, eyes on the floor, hands clasped so hard her knuckles whitened. The air in the room felt thin, like everyone was holding their breath at once. Kellen asked for his phone, and he said it was taken from him. He said his backpack was in the basement storage closet. An officer went down with Teague and retrieved it, carefully, like evidence. Inside the backpack was a notebook with scribbled dates and names. There was also a small digital voice recorder, the kind used for lectures. Kellen said he carried it because he forgot things when he got anxious. He said he recorded meetings sometimes so he could replay them later. The officers exchanged a look, and one of them asked if he recorded today. Kellen nodded and said, "I think it's still running." Teague felt a cold flush, because that meant everything might be on tape. The recorder was still on, and its red light blinked weakly. The officer stopped it, bagged it, and noted the time. They didn't play it there, but later reports referenced a partial audio file. It reportedly captured voices arguing about liability, reputation, and keeping things contained. It also reportedly captured a sentence about the lock, spoken like an instruction. Teague didn't hear the audio himself, not that day. What he saw was the way Hollis's confidence cracked when the recorder appeared. His smile faded, and his eyes went sharp, like a cornered animal. He asked who was allowed to record, and an officer told him to stay quiet. Maris's face looked like it might fold in half, and she pressed a palm to her mouth. Kellen also had photos on his phone, which officers later recovered from the basement. He had snapped pictures of a hallway bulletin board before the session started. The photos showed a calendar with handwritten blocks and initials beside time slots. There were also sticky notes with room numbers, and one said basement. Another said lock check, with a date written for that morning. Teague asked how Kellen took photos if his phone was taken. Kellen said he took them earlier when nobody was watching, then hid the phone briefly. He said someone found it later, after he asked to leave. That detail sounded messy, but it also sounded like the truth. The photos had timestamps that fit the sequence, according to the officer's comment. By late afternoon, investigators from the county arrived. They took statements, photographed the lock, and measured the scuff marks on the wall. They also photographed the new handrail and the paint that smeared near the scratches. A technician swabbed the tape scraps for residue and fingerprints. Teague watched from the side, trying to make his breathing slow and steady. Kellen was taken to a clinic for evaluation, mostly for dehydration and stress. A nurse later noted bruising consistent with restraint, according to a summary Teague heard. The clinic also documented abrasions on his wrists and cheek. None of it proved motive, but it supported Kellen's story. Teague sat in his truck afterward, hands on the wheel, not turning the key. He went back to his office and filed his inspection report anyway. He noted the padlocked egress door, the broken lock, and the potential hazard. He attached photos he took after police arrived, keeping them factual and clean. He also wrote a separate memo for his supervisor, because this felt bigger. His supervisor told him to forward everything to the county attorney's office. Over the next week, rumors spread through town faster than any official update. People argued at diners, in parking lots, and on church steps after Sunday service. Some said Kellen was trespassing. Others said the church was hiding something. Teague tried to keep his head down, but he kept getting calls. A local reporter left voicemails asking for comment, and he never answered. Then, a new detail surfaced, and it shifted the whole story. A retired maintenance worker came forward after seeing the news segment. He said the basement door had been altered years earlier. He said the church once had a crash bar on the inside, but it was removed. He said he complained, and he was told it was temporary during renovations. The maintenance worker provided an old photo taken during a volunteer workday. It showed the same door, but with the crash bar still installed. In the background, a whiteboard listed tasks, and one line said, "Remove bar." The date on the whiteboard was written in thick marker, 2012. Teague stared at the photo in disbelief because it matched what he saw now. That meant the basement exit had been made easier to trap from the outside. Teague realized the padlock was not an accident or a one-time panic. It looked more like a system, slowly built to be invisible. A door that should always open had been turned into a cage. The unsettling truth wasn't only what happened to Kellen, it was how ready the building was. Investigators requested records related to renovations and safety inspections. They also subpoenaed emails from the church's administrative accounts. According to later summaries, certain messages referenced discretion and risk management. There were also references to a room used for difficult conversations. Nobody wrote the word basement as a confession, but the hints lined up. Teague was asked to come in for a follow-up interview. He described the lock, the noises, Maris's reaction, and Hollis's ring. He also mentioned the smell of cleaner, since Kellen remembered it too. An investigator told him they found a jug of industrial solvent downstairs. It was used for stripping floors, but it also made tape stick better for a while. Weeks later, the county released a statement that charges were being considered. They didn't name suspects in public, but they confirmed a continuing inquiry. The church suspended counseling sessions and closed the basement to the public. Hollis resigned, citing health reasons, and Maris took a leave of absence. None of that felt like closure. It felt like a curtain drawn quickly. Teague kept thinking about the moment the lock snapped. He had expected an empty room and a minor code violation. Instead, he found a person waiting in the dark, trying not to panic. He wondered how many others had sat down there and stayed quiet. He wondered how many people believed it was for their own good. Kellen eventually moved away, according to a neighbor who spoke to Teague later. He didn't want to be known as the basement kid for the rest of his life. Teague respected that, and he never tried to contact him again. He kept his role small, just a witness who did his job. Still, the sound of that thump behind the door stayed with him. On certain mornings, Teague drove past the church on his way to inspections. The building looked the same from the street, steady and respectable. Sunlight hit the stained glass, and cars lined the curb for community events. But Teague knew what could be hidden behind a quiet hallway. He learned that safety wasn't only codes and rails, it was who held the keys. The stories. "You can't outrun winter on that mountain road." The dispatcher log said the call lasted 47 seconds, and then the line went dead without a word. By dawn, a county plow driver found the truck door open, the engine warm, and nobody in the seat. On a Monday in late January, Lark Tolland woke before sunrise in a rental cabin above a ski town. He was 36, and he worked as a claims field investigator for a regional insurance company. His job was simple: on paper, verify damage, take photos, and write reports that could survive court. That morning, he planned to inspect a fender bender and be back in town before the next storm. The road down the mountain was narrow and shaded, with old pines that kept the snow from melting. A blinking sign near the first switchback warned about whiteouts and sudden closures in winter weather. Lark had seen signs like that everywhere, but this one looked freshly bent, like someone hit it hard. He slowed anyway, because the sky had that pale look that meant snow could start at any moment. The claim file on his passenger seat was thin, almost too thin to justify the drive. A delivery van had allegedly slid into a guardrail 2 nights earlier, then limped to a turnout. The driver reported minor injuries and a dented quarter panel, then asked for a quick settlement. The location was vague, described only as mile marker 27, near a scenic overlook. He reached the overlook and found something that did not match a minor accident report. The guardrail was scraped clean of paint, and the snowbank behind it was packed with broken glass. A few feet away, a second set of tire tracks cut off the shoulder and dipped into the trees. Those tracks had been dusted over, but the grooves still showed through like bruises under skin. Lark parked, stepped out, and felt the cold clamp on his lungs in a way that stole patience. He took wide shots first, then moved closer, keeping his boots on the packed snow for traction. The glass pieces were green and thick, more like an older truck window than a modern van pane. He also saw a torn strip of reflective tape, the kind that came on utility trucks. He used a small ruler for scale and photographed everything, then recorded a quick voice memo. The timestamp on his phone read 9:14, and he noted the wind was picking up fast. He tried calling the number on the claim, but it went straight to voicemail without ringing. The mailbox greeting was generic, and it ended with a click that sounded oddly clipped. Back in the cab, he opened the claim photos the driver had submitted. They showed a clean dent, no shattered window, and no guardrail scrape that deep. The van in the pictures also had no reflective tape, and its plate was never visible. Lark felt the small itch of a file that was built to be paid quickly. He drove a short loop to find the mile marker again because the road numbers rarely lined up. Near a bend, he spotted a maintenance gate and a service road leading into the trees. A fresh powder layer covered it, but a faint pair of tracks ran straight through the snow. They looked like a heavier vehicle, wide stance and deep tread pattern. He turned onto the service road slowly, keeping his tires in the grooves to avoid getting stuck. The trees closed in, and the temperature dropped like he crossed an invisible line. After a quarter mile, he found a shallow ditch and a broken branch sprayed with dried mud. That mud was dark and gritty, like it came from a lower elevation where the ground was exposed. A few yards beyond the ditch, something metallic flashed under the snow. Lark knelt and brushed it clear with his glove, then froze when he saw what it was. It was a small radio microphone, the kind clipped to a uniform with a torn cord end. The push button was cracked, and the backplate had a number etched into it. He did not pocket it, because he had learned what that could look like later. He photographed it from every angle, then used a clean bag from his kit to cover it. He set a bright survey flag beside it so he could return with someone official. Then he walked back to the truck, feeling the snow start to sting his cheeks. At the overlook again, a state trooper cruiser sat angled across the turnout. The trooper was a stocky man with tired eyes, and his name tag read Kincaid. He looked at Lark's company badge and asked why he was off the main road. Lark explained the claim, then mentioned the reflective tape and the radio microphone. Kincaid's face changed at the word microphone, like a door quietly closing. He asked Lark to wait, then spoke into his own radio with careful, clipped phrases. When he returned, he told Lark the area was restricted due to a missing person report. He did not give details, but his jaw tightened when the wind gusted. Lark offered to show his photos, and Kincaid hesitated before nodding once. Inside the cruiser, Lark scrolled through the images, pointing out the glass and tape. Kincaid stared at the green glass, then at the guardrail scrape, and swallowed hard. He asked if Lark had found anything else, and Lark mentioned the service road tracks. Kincaid told him to stay put, then drove off toward the service gate without lights. Lark watched the cruiser disappear, and the quiet that followed felt deliberate. A few minutes later, Lark's phone buzzed with an unknown number calling him again. He answered, and a man's voice said, "Turn around and go back to town." The voice was calm, almost bored, and it did not sound like law enforcement. Lark asked who it was, and the line went dead with the same clipped click. He called back, but the number did not connect, like it was never real. He sat still, hands on the wheel, listening to the wind push snow across the glass. He could have left, and nobody would blame him for staying in his lane. Instead, he opened the claim file again, looking for anything he had missed. The driver name was written as Holden Rusk, but the signature was a rough block scrawl. The listed employer was a courier firm, yet the policyholder was a private individual. He checked the vehicle identification number recorded in the report. It was missing a digit, and the typed font looked copied from another document. Lark felt a cold certainty settle in, because small mistakes like that were never accidents. Someone had wanted the file to move fast, and they had not expected a field visit. Snow began to fall in thicker flakes, and the sky flattened into a dull white ceiling. Lark decided to head to the sheriff's substation in town because the trooper had left him alone. On the way down, the road narrowed further, and the wind started to shove the truck sideways. He kept both hands tight, and he drove slow enough that impatience could not tempt him. Halfway down, he saw a pair of headlights in his mirror, closing the distance too quickly. A dark pickup rode his bumper, then flashed high beams twice like an impatient warning. Lark pulled to the right where he could, but the pickup did not pass. It stayed behind him, keeping the same tight gap like it was hurting him. At a wide bend, the pickup finally swung around, spraying slush onto his windshield. As it passed, Lark caught a glimpse of a ladder rack and a stripe of reflective tape. The tape was torn, with a jagged edge that matched the piece he photographed at the overlook. The pickup did not speed away. It slowed ahead, forcing Lark to brake. Lark's pulse thudded in his ears, but he kept the wheel straight and his eyes forward. He reached for his phone and started recording audio, keeping it low by his thigh. The pickup drifted toward the center line, blocking him from passing safely. Then its brake lights flared, and the truck came to a near stop in the snow. Lark honked once, and the sound died in the storm like it was swallowed. A door opened on the pickup, and a figure stepped out wearing a dark coat and a hood. The figure raised a hand, not waving, more like signaling him to stay where he was. Lark shifted into reverse slowly, because panic made bad decisions feel like good ones. The pickup's figure walked toward him, boots crunching, head lowered against the wind. Lark kept backing, inches at a time, watching the road edge in his side mirror. His tires started to slip on the packed snow, and the engine strained. He stopped reversing, because another foot would put him into the ditch. The figure reached his driver door and tapped the window with 2 knuckles. Lark did not roll it down, and he did not unlock the door. He held up his badge through the glass and said, "I'm going to the sheriff right now." The figure leaned close, and Lark saw a beard and a pale scar under one eye. The man said, "You don't want to be out here when the road closes." His voice was the same calm voice from the phone, and it carried like he was unbothered. Lark said, "Move your truck, or I'm calling this in as a threat." The man smiled once, and it looked practiced. Then he stepped back. He walked to the pickup and climbed in, and the truck rolled forward again. Lark followed at a safer distance, keeping the audio recording running. The pickup took the next turnout suddenly, then vanished into the trees. Lark did not follow, because the lesson was clear. Someone knew exactly where he was. In town, the sheriff's substation was warm and smelled like coffee and wet wool. A deputy with a tired face took his statement, then asked him to wait in the lobby. After 10 minutes, Sheriff Rel Marston came out, coat still dusted with snow. He was in his late 50s, and his eyes looked like they had missed too much sleep. Marston introduced himself and listened without interrupting, hands folded behind his back. Lark showed the photos, the claim file, and the audio clip of the bearded man's warning. Marston nodded slowly, then asked if Lark had shared the microphone find with anyone else. Lark said he only told Trooper Kincaid, and Marston's mouth tightened at the name. Marston stepped into an office and made 2 calls, speaking low and careful. When he returned, he said a plow operator had reported an abandoned utility truck up the mountain. The operator said the door was open, the engine was warm, and a radio mic was missing. That matched Lark's find, and it matched the green glass scattered near the guardrail. Marston said the missing person was a county road technician, last seen checking a sensor array. Lark asked why a road technician would be connected to an insurance claim. Marston replied that it might be a distraction, or it might be a way to move a vehicle quietly. He said dispatch had received a strange call the previous night from a payphone near the mountain lodge. The caller reported a crash location, then hung up before answering any follow-up questions. The report was logged, but the storm had delayed a response until morning. Marston asked Lark to forward the claim documents, and Lark did it from his email app. Then Marston asked for the unknown number that called him, and Lark gave it. A deputy ran it through their system, and it returned as an unassigned routing number. Marston said that could happen with certain internet calling tools, and his face stayed flat. By afternoon, the storm thickened, and the mountain road closed behind the plows. Lark stayed in town, because leaving would mean returning to the same road in worse weather. Marston offered him a spare desk, and Lark spent hours comparing times and photos. He zoomed in on the claim images, looking for reflections, signage, and anything that anchored location. In one picture, he noticed a faint sign edge behind the van, showing a shape of a pine logo. That logo matched the ski area, not the overlook, and the snowbanks were shaped differently. The van photos had been taken in a plowed lot, not on a mountain shoulder. It meant the crash never happened where the claim said it did. Lark pointed it out, and Marston asked his deputy to pull traffic camera footage from the town entrance. The footage was grainy, but it showed a dark pickup with a ladder rack entering town 2 nights earlier. It also showed a utility truck following behind, then turning toward the mountain road after midnight. 20 minutes later, the same pickup came back alone, moving fast and wobbling like it was overloaded. Marston stared at the screen and said, "That utility truck never came back down." The next day, weather cleared just enough for a search team to go up with snowmobiles. Lark went along as a civilian witness, staying behind the deputies and marked vehicles. Near the service gate, they found the ditch and the broken branch, just like Lark described. They also found drag marks leading downhill, as if something heavy had been pulled on a tarp. The marks ended near a culvert where the snow hit a dark opening under the road. A deputy shined a light inside, and the beam caught a flash of reflective tape. They crawled in carefully and found the missing county utility truck wedged at an angle. The windshield was shattered, and the passenger window was gone, matching the green glass outside. There was no body in the cab, but there was a flashlight, a notebook, and a torn jacket sleeve. The notebook was damp but readable, and it looked like field notes. It listed sensor readings and timestamps, and then a final line that made Marston go quiet. The last entry said, "Saw an unmarked truck by the sensor box, driver wearing a fake badge." It ended with the words, "Call dispatch now," and then the ink smeared like the pen slipped. Marston said the technician had likely interrupted a theft because those sensor boxes used copper wiring. Copper theft was common, and crews sometimes got targeted because they worked alone at odd hours. But the fake badge detail changed things because it suggested planning, not opportunistic stealing. Lark asked about Trooper Kincaid, and Marston hesitated before answering. Marston said Kincaid was on administrative leave pending an internal review. He said a witness had reported seeing a cruiser near the service road around the time of the crash. That witness also described the trooper speaking with a bearded man by a pickup with a ladder rack. Marston did not accuse anyone outright, but the tightness in his voice carried the implication. Back at the substation, Marston received a call from state investigators. They had traced the fake claim documents to a printer at a small office rental in a nearby city. The office had been rented under a false name, paid in cash, and emptied the day after the storm. But a trash bin behind the building held a crumpled page with a copied policy template. On that page was a scribbled note that matched the etched number on the radio microphone. The etched number turned out to be an inventory tag from the county road department. It meant someone had handled the microphone long enough to scratch it, then dropped it in the snow. Lark realized the microphone was not lost during the crash. It was removed on purpose. The person who called him had tried to push him off the mountain before he connected the pieces. The winter storm was not just weather, it was cover, and it arrived right on schedule. 2 weeks later, the technician was found alive in a remote hunting shed below the tree line. Reportedly, he had a concussion and frostbite, and he had been too confused to find the road. Searchers found him after a dog caught his scent near the creek, then led handlers uphill. He told investigators he remembered voices, a flashlight in his face, and someone saying, "No witnesses." He also remembered a radio crackle, then silence, as if the battery had been pulled. The case did not wrap neatly, and Lark never claimed it did. There were reports of arrests tied to theft rings, and there were rumors about internal misconduct. What stayed solid were the logs, the camera clips, and the small mismatches that started it all. A bent warning sign, glass the wrong color, and reflective tape that did not belong on a van. When Lark finally drove home, the mountain road was open and sunny, but he still gripped the wheel hard. He stopped once at the overlook and looked at the guardrail, now patched and repainted. It looked normal again, which was the point of winter. It erased the edges fast. But in his report, the photos stayed sharp, and the timestamps stayed honest. The stories. The most troubling cases of missing hikers. The case file was thin, but the silence around it was heavy. It started with a trail register page that ended mid-sentence, and nobody could explain why. In early October of 2017, Lyle Maris was 38 and worked as a county records clerk. He handled archived reports, public requests, and the boring paperwork that kept a small sheriff office afloat. That morning, he planned to scan old search logs, then get home before the first hard rain. He did not plan to reopen a missing hiker's case that everyone acted allergic to. The request came in a plain envelope with no return address and a sticky note inside. The note asked for copies of 3 files, all tied to the same state forest trail system. It also included a date range, and it ended with one sentence that felt like a dare. Do not call it an accident until you read the audio. Lyle was used to weird mail, but this one carried details only staff should know. He pulled the files from the back room, and he noticed something immediately. Each folder had the same handwriting on the spine and a strip of tape over the label. The tape looked old, and it had been trimmed clean, like someone wanted it to look official. The first file was from late summer of 2011, involving 2-day hikers. They parked at a trailhead near a reservoir and never returned before dark. Search teams found their car, their lunches, and their jackets folded on the back seat. The report said there was no sign of foul play, but it also said the keys were missing. The second file was from 2013, involving a couple and their dog. Witness statements placed them on the main trail at noon, heading toward a fire lookout. The dog was found the next day, wet and shaking, with a leash still attached. The couple was never found, and the report ended with a single line about bad weather. The third file was newer, from late spring of 2015, involving a lone hiker. Her friends said she was careful, and she always texted when she hit a landmark. Her phone last pinged near an old service road, then went quiet like it had been turned off. Searchers found her pack under a downed log, and it was neatly zipped and dry. Lyle did not like the pattern, but he could not say why yet. None of the cases were famous, and they were not tied to any public scandal. Still, someone had blocked the labels, and someone wanted the audio. Lyle checked the file inventory, and he saw a line item called Field Recording Station Copy. The sheriff office kept old audio in a small evidence room, but access was logged. Lyle asked the evidence tech, a man named Bracken Rudd, 46, civilian specialist. Bracken said the tapes were real, and he looked annoyed that Lyle even knew about them. He said the recordings came from a volunteer search leader who carried a handheld radio. Then he added that the recordings were mostly wind and there was nothing helpful. Lyle asked if he could listen anyway, because the request specifically mentioned audio. Bracken shrugged, then signed the checkout in a slow and careful way. He handed Lyle a small digital file player with a single folder loaded onto it. The folder name matched the trail system, and it held 3 audio clips. Lyle listened at his desk with cheap headphones, trying to keep his face neutral. The first clip started with radio chatter, then a pause, then a clipped female voice. Copy. Team 2 is at marker 7. Hearing something ahead? Might be hikers. Then there was a low sound under the static, like a steady tone that wavered. The voice returned, quieter now, and it did not sound like she was joking. Someone is whistling. It is close, but I do not see anybody on the trail. A second voice replied from base, asking if she meant a bird call. She said no, and then the clip ended with a sharp click. The second clip was longer and worse because it included more than one witness. A man spoke first, and he was breathing hard, like he had been running uphill. Base, this is Ridge Team. We found the dog, no people. The dog keeps pulling north. Base asked for location, and he gave a marker number and a creek crossing. Then the same low tone appeared again, faint but constant, riding under every word. The man said, "Do you hear that? Tell me you hear that." Base replied, "Negative. Copy your traffic. What is the sound on your end?" The man did not answer right away, and when he did, his voice had changed. "It is like a phone ringing, but not right. It is coming from the trees." Another voice joined in, a woman, and she sounded angry and scared at the same time. "Stop calling back. Whoever is doing it is moving. It keeps pacing us." Base told them to regroup, and the clip ended with heavy footsteps and a curse. The third clip was from the 2015 case, and it started calm. A volunteer said they had found the pack, and it looked staged, not dropped. Base asked what he meant, and he said the pack was clean and centered on the log. Then the tone appeared again, louder this time, and it pulsed like a slow alarm. The volunteer lowered his voice, like he was afraid the radio itself could betray him. "Someone is answering our calls. Not on the repeater. It is local, like line of sight." Bass asked who was answering, and the volunteer said he could not see them. He added one detail that made Lyle pause with his hand on the volume knob. It is using her voice. It is using her exact voice. Bass demanded he repeat, and the volunteer said, "It is her. It is the missing hiker." Then a sound cut through the tone, a short laugh, and it was too clean to be wind. The clip ended right after, as if somebody had hit stop on purpose. Lyle sat back, and he felt his throat tighten in a way he could not explain. He had heard enough dispatch audio to know when something was off. Voices on radios can warp, but this sounded like a deliberate imitation. He checked the player, and he saw a note field attached to the third clip. The note was timestamped, and it said, "Do not release, causes copycat behavior." Lyle stared at it, because it did not sound like normal evidence language. He opened the case file again and looked for the author of the note. It was signed by a lieutenant who retired years ago, and who had a reputation for control. Lyle did what records clerks do when they get nervous. He went to the paper trail, because paper does not care about feelings. He pulled dispatch logs for the search days, and he compared timestamps to the clips. The audio did not match the official logs, not perfectly, not even close. In the 2011 case, the log showed no mention of whistling. In the 2013 case, the log listed routine updates and nothing unusual. In the 2015 case, the log said the pack was found, then it jumped ahead. The gap was 47 minutes, and the log had a generic entry that did not explain it. Lyle printed the pages, then walked them to the deputy captain, who oversaw records. The captain was named Odessa Train, 52, patrol supervisor, and she had seen everything. She read the pages, then listened to the clips with a stiff jaw. When she finished, she did not say it was fake, and she did not say it was real. She asked where Lyle got the player, and he said from evidence checkout. She asked who else had access, and he named Bracken and a few supervisors. Odessa told Lyle to stop working the case, but her tone was not angry. It sounded like caution, the kind that comes from knowing a door should stay shut. Lyle nodded, but he could not let it go after hearing the imitation claim. He asked Odessa one direct question, and he kept his voice low. "Did anybody ever find the source of that tone?" Odessa held his eyes for a moment, then said, "They said it was interference." That answer was not satisfying, because interference does not track across years like a fingerprint. Lyle went home with the envelope still on his desk, and he barely tasted dinner. That night, he searched old newspaper microfilm, because the internet did not hold local history. He found brief articles about each case, but they all shared one strange detail. Each article mentioned a ranger station hotline set up for tips. The number was printed, then removed in later editions, like it had been a mistake. Lyle checked the old phone list, and he found the number was still active. It rang to a recorded message that said the station was closed for the season. The next morning, Lyle arrived early and asked Bracken about the hotline number. Bracken stiffened, then said that number belonged to a radio patch line, not a public phone. He said it was used during searches to bridge handheld radios to dispatch when coverage failed. Lyle asked why a patch line had a public recording, and Bracken said he did not know. Lyle did not press harder, because Bracken looked like he wanted to end the conversation. Instead, Lyle called the number from his desk phone, then held his recorder near the speaker. The message played, and it sounded normal at first, like any board announcement voice. Then, under the words, the low tone crept in. Faint, but present, like a shadow. Lyle stopped the recording, then replayed it, and the tone was still there. He called again, and the tone shifted slightly, like it was responding to the call. He did it a third time, and he heard a tiny click between phrases. It was the same click that ended the first clip from 2011. Lyle brought his recording to Odessa, and this time she did not tell him to stop. She told him to sit down, then she locked her office door. Odessa said there was something older than the three cases, and it was why people avoided them. She said a decade earlier, a volunteer had abused the patch system to prank search teams. According to witness statements, the volunteer used the patch to mimic lost hikers on radio. He did it to keep morale up and to test response time, and it went too far. A young deputy confronted him in the woods, and a fight happened near a ravine. The volunteer fell, and the deputy claimed it was an accident, and the file vanished. Odessa said the patch line was never fully decommissioned after that. It stayed because it was useful and because nobody wanted to admit the history. She said some supervisors treated it like a ghost story and others treated it like leverage. When new hikers went missing, the old prank story came back, like a stain that would not wash. Lyle asked if that explained the imitation voice in the 2015 audio. Odessa said it could, but only if somebody still had access and still wanted control. She said the most troubling part was not the tone or the voice. It was the way the official logs had been cleaned, as if someone edited reality after the fact. Together, they pulled the maintenance records for the patch system. They found work orders signed by the retired lieutenant years after his supposed retirement. The signatures matched his style, and the dates aligned with the 3 search periods. It looked like he kept his hands on the system, even after he stopped wearing a badge. Odessa contacted the county IT contractor who handled old radio gear, a man named Kellen Swope, 44. Kellen agreed to inspect the patch cabinet at the ranger station site. He found a hidden add-on board that allowed call forwarding and voice playback. It was not standard equipment, and it was installed cleanly, like someone knew what they were doing. Kellen also found a small memory card taped inside the cabinet. The card contained voice samples labeled with dates and trail marker numbers. Some samples were harmless, like volunteers calling in their positions. Others were short clips of hikers on the day they vanished, taken from tip line voicemails. That was the payoff nobody wanted, because it tied the missing hikers to a human choice. Someone had been collecting their voices, then using those voices during searches. It did not prove the same person caused the disappearances, and Odessa was careful about that. But it proved someone exploited the chaos, and someone wanted the searches to move a certain way. In one file, a witness had reported hearing a phone ring in the trees near a creek. The search team went toward the sound, and they left the main trail for almost an hour. In another file, a volunteer heard a voice call her name from a ravine, and she went alone. She later told investigators she felt embarrassed because it sounded like her missing friend. Those moments were the cracks, and someone had been pushing on them. Odessa opened an internal investigation, and the county prosecutor reviewed what they could prove. The retired lieutenant was questioned, and he denied installing anything. He said the card was planted, and he said the clips were taken out of context. No public arrest followed, at least not in a way the town could point to and feel satisfied. But the ranger station patch line was shut down, and the hotline number went dead. New policy required sealed logs and outside audits during every future search. The 3 cases remained unsolved because the woods do not offer clean answers. Still, the way the searches unfolded now had a more believable explanation. Lyle kept thinking about the envelope and the sticky note, and who sent it. He asked Odessa if she knew, and she said she had a strong guess. She believed it was a former volunteer, someone who felt guilty and wanted the truth on record. That person did not want credit and did not want to be seen as a snitch in a small county. Weeks later, Lyle returned the files to storage and retaped the labels properly. He did not do it to hide them, he did it to mark them as normal evidence again. Some cases become legends, and legends make people careless in the wrong ways. These cases were troubling because they showed how easy it is to steer a search. When hikers vanish, the first enemy is time, and the second enemy is confusion. A single false sound can move trained people off a trail and into wasted hours. The woods can be cruel on their own, but people can make them worse. That is why the most troubling cases are not always about what happened out there. The stories. Paramedic who broke protocol after the storm. The run sheet said the call never happened, but 3 witnesses remembered the ambulance anyway. The medic who signed it broke protocol, and the storm was only part of the reason. In early September of 2019, Reeve Donlin was 39 and worked as a paramedic for a county EMS service. He lived in a small river town in the Midwest, where storms tore up trees and power lines every summer. That morning, the remnants of a hurricane had drifted inland, dumping rain hard for hours. By noon, the river spilled into streets, and the dispatch center started stacking calls like plates. Reeve showed up for a 12-hour shift with dry socks, extra gloves, and a calm face. His partner, Talia Mendez, was 27 and a brand new EMT who still checked everything twice. They stocked the truck, ran their radio check, and waited in the bay with doors open. The supervisor told crews to stage on high ground and avoid floodwater. No exceptions today. Reeve nodded like always, but his eyes stayed on the weather map taped to the wall. He had worked enough storms to know the map never showed the small disasters. Their first calls were simple: a fall in a dark stairwell, a diabetic who ran out of insulin. They moved slow because debris made every street feel like a maze. Around 4:30, the radio crackled with a priority tone that made Talia sit up straight. Dispatch gave an address near the river, then stopped and corrected it to a cross street. The dispatcher's voice sounded tight, like she had been arguing with someone off mic. The notes said, "Possible trapped person, caller unsure, water rising." The supervisor came on next and repeated the standing order about not entering flood zones. Reeve keyed up and asked if fire was en route for water rescue support. The supervisor said resources were thin and crews should not self-deploy into danger. Reeve acknowledged, then stared at the tablet, reading the caller number and name. The caller name matched someone Reeve recognized from a prior overdose call, a man named Kester Vale. Kester lived in a rental house near the river with a porch that sagged like a tired jaw. Reeve remembered Kester as loud, scared, and protective of his younger sister. That sister, Marlon Vale, had asthma and a heart condition, according to old chart notes. Reeve also remembered the last crew found their smoke detectors missing. Talia asked if they should stage at the edge and wait for fire, like they were told. Reeve said yes, but he turned the wheel toward the river anyway, taking the shortest route. They stopped where the pavement dipped into brown water and the barricade floated sideways. A neighbor waved both arms from a driveway, yelling something that the rain swallowed. Reeve got out, boots sinking in mud, and asked where the caller was. The neighbor pointed at the Vale house, and the porch light blinked like a weak heartbeat. Water covered the front steps, and the yard looked like a shallow lake. Kester stood at a window, banging on the glass with his palm, face pale and furious. Reeve walked closer until the water reached his knees, then stopped and assessed. He could see Marlon inside, sitting on the couch, shoulders hunched, breathing fast. Talia stayed by the truck, scanning for drifting debris and watching the water level. Reeve called fire dispatch on the radio and asked again for a rescue team. The dispatcher said units were tied up and an estimated arrival time was unknown. Kester slammed the window again and shouted, "She can't breathe! She's turning gray!" Reeve looked at Marlon's lips, and even through glass, he saw a bluish tint. Protocol said, "Wait, do not enter moving water, do not compromise the crew for one patient." Reeve knew the rule, and he had repeated it to rookies a dozen times. He also knew asthma did not politely pause while resources got sorted. He called his supervisor and described what he saw, then asked for permission to enter. The supervisor said no and added that any entry would be considered a direct violation. Reeve ended the call and took one more look at Marlon's posture and the panic in her eyes. He told Talia to keep the truck in place and to call for law and fire again. Talia asked if he was serious, and Reeve said, "Stay dry and keep eyes on me." Then he waded forward, one step at a time, feeling the push of water on his thighs. He reached the porch rail, grabbed it, and pulled himself to the door. Kester opened it fast, and the smell inside hit like wet carpet and old cigarettes. Reeve told Kester to move back, then stepped into ankle-deep water on the living room floor. Marlon tried to speak, but her words came out broken and thin. Reeve knelt beside her, checked her pulse, and listened to her lungs. The wheeze was tight, and her oxygen level on the finger clip was dropping fast. He reached for his kit and realized the bag was still with Talia at the truck. Reeve swore under his breath and asked Kester if they had any inhalers. Kester ran to a kitchen drawer and returned with a rescue inhaler with a cracked cap. Reeve checked the label and saw it was expired, but it was better than nothing. He coached Marlon through 2 puffs, then watched her chest keep fighting. Her breathing did not ease, and her hands started to tremble in a way Reeve did not like. He needed a nebulizer treatment and oxygen, and he needed it now. He asked Kester where the nearest high spot was, and Kester pointed toward a back window. Behind the house, the ground rose slightly, but the walkway was narrow and clogged with branches. Reeve decided to move Marlon out, even if it meant carrying her through water. He called to Talia through the open door, and his voice sounded small in the rain. Talia ran closer with the jump bag and the oxygen kit held over her head. She stopped at the waterline and looked at Reeve like she wanted to argue. Reeve told her to stay at the edge and hand him what he asked for. Talia slid the oxygen tubing and mask across the porch rail like a lifeline. Reeve put the mask on Marlin, opened the valve, and watched her shoulders loosen slightly. He set up the nebulizer with albuterol, hands steady even as water bumped his knees. Marlin's eyes stayed locked on him, desperate and trusting in a way that felt heavy. Kester hovered close, asking if she was dying, and Reeve told him to help by staying quiet. The treatment ran, and the wheeze softened, but it did not clear the way Reeve expected. That was when Reeve noticed bruising on Marlin's neck, faint fingerprints under damp hair. He did not react outwardly, but his mind filed it away with a cold click. He asked Marlin what happened before the breathing got bad, and she glanced at Kester first. Marlin said, "I slipped," then looked down, then added, "I fell in the hallway." Reeve asked where, and Marlin pointed toward a door that led to the back room. Reeve told Kester to keep holding the oxygen, then moved toward the back room carefully. He opened the door and saw a mattress on the floor, a space heater, and a chain lock on the inside. The chain lock was mounted high, like it was meant to keep someone in, not keep someone out. There was also a phone on the mattress with a cracked screen, and it was powered off. Reeve stood still, hearing the rain outside, and felt the call shift in his gut. He returned to Marlin and asked if she had called 911 herself. Marlin shook her head, then nodded, then said, "I tried, but it wouldn't work." Kester cut in and said the cell towers were down, and that was why he called from a neighbor. Reeve asked the neighbor's name, and Kester hesitated before answering. Talia caught that hesitation, and her eyes flicked to Reeve with a silent question. Marlin's breathing improved enough to move, so Reeve chose the back window exit. He and Kester carried her together, Reeve supporting her shoulders and Kester lifting her legs. They stepped into water again, pushing through branches, and Reeve kept talking to Marlin steadily. Talia followed along the higher edge, keeping oxygen flowing, watching for slips. They reached the small rise behind the house, where the mud was thick but not submerged. Reeve radioed that they had a patient and needed a clear route to transport. The supervisor replied with a clipped tone, asking why the crew entered the flood zone. Reeve said, "Patient was failing, no rescue resources available," and kept his voice controlled. The supervisor told them to return to staging and wait for fire to assist extraction. Reeve looked at Marlin, saw her lips still tinted, and decided he was done waiting. He loaded Marlin onto the stretcher on the high ground, then angled it toward a neighbor's driveway. The driveway sloped upward to dry pavement, and it was passable if they moved fast. They rolled the stretcher, wheels bouncing, while Kester ran ahead, clearing branches. Talia stayed near the head of the stretcher, keeping the mask sealed, face tense and focused. They got Marlin into the ambulance and started toward the hospital without lights to avoid debris panic. On the way, Reeve documented everything out loud, so the dash audio captured it. He said arrival time, patient condition, oxygen levels, treatment given, and response observed. He also said, noted bruising on neck, pattern consistent with grip, keeping the tone neutral. Talia stared at him, surprised, then looked back to Marlin, who had drifted into shallow sleep. Reeve called the receiving hospital and gave a report, including the bruising and the locked room. At the hospital, staff moved Marlin into a bay, placed monitors, and started additional breathing support. A nurse asked Kester to wait outside, and Kester argued until security stepped in. Reeve watched Kester's eyes, calculating and angry, then watched him step back too quickly. Talia whispered, "That didn't feel right," and Reeve nodded without looking at her. He finished the electronic chart, then paused at the signature line. Protocol violation meant the chart would draw attention, and attention meant questions about the house. Reeve had a choice, and he made it in a quiet, uncomfortable way. He entered the call as a different location, the dry driveway, not the flooded home. He left out the chain lock detail, and he described the bruising as possible injury from fall. Talia saw the entries and asked why he was softening it, and Reeve said, "Trust me for now." Back at the station, the supervisor called Reeve into an office and shut the door. He said the crew had endangered themselves and the truck, and the county could face liability. Reeve did not argue about the water, because the facts were the facts. He said the patient would have died if they waited, and he meant it. The supervisor said the run sheet looked clean enough, then asked who told Reeve about the address. That question landed wrong, like the supervisor cared more about blame than care. Reeve said dispatch gave it, and the supervisor said dispatch records were being audited. He warned Reeve not to freelance during a declared emergency, then dismissed him with a cold stare. Outside, Talia waited, and she asked if they were fired. Reeve told her no, but he said they needed to keep their own notes. Reeve went home and opened a notebook he kept for odd calls, writing the timeline carefully. He wrote the door chain detail, the powered-off phone, and Kester's hesitation about the neighbor. He also wrote that the supervisor seemed too eager for the chart to look tidy. The next day, he called an old friend who worked in hospital administration off the record. The friend said Marlon was stable, but she asked to speak to someone without family present. That was when the story cracked open into something larger than a storm call. According to a nurse statement later filed, Marlon said Kester had been keeping her inside. She reportedly said he took her phone, locked the back room, and used fear to control her. She also reportedly said the storm was his excuse because no one would come quickly. The nurse called social services, and law enforcement opened a separate inquiry. Reeve's run sheet, however, did not match the nurse timeline, and that mismatch mattered. A week later, Internal Affairs pulled radio traffic, dispatch logs, and the ambulance GPS history. They noticed the truck entered a restricted flood zone and stayed there for 17 minutes. The supervisor claimed he was never told the patient was in distress, which contradicted the recorded call. Reeve requested the audio, and when he heard it, he caught something that made his jaw tighten. There was a gap in the supervisor's radio response, like a clipped section, not just static. Reeve asked dispatch for the raw recording, not the stitched file used for review. A dispatcher named Cora Helvey met him at a coffee shop, careful and nervous. She said she was not supposed to share anything, but she hated what was happening. Cora said the supervisor had direct access to the recording system during emergencies. She also said he sometimes cleaned up audio when crews got complaints. Reeve did not record Cora, but he wrote down what she said, time and date included. He then requested a public records copy through the county clerk, using the proper process. The response came back with a note that certain files were exempt due to personnel review. That answer did not deny the files existed, and it did not confirm they were intact. Reeve kept pushing, not loudly, but steadily, the way he handled stubborn insurance forms. Meanwhile, detectives interviewed the neighbor who owned the driveway where Marlon was loaded. The neighbor confirmed Kester ran to his house and demanded to use his phone. He also said Kester was already soaked, like he had been in the water before calling. The neighbor said he heard shouting inside the Vale house earlier, before the worst rain. Those details showed up in witness statements, and they lined up with what Reeve suspected. The twist came from something small, and it came from Talia's attention to details. She remembered the cracked inhaler Kester handed over, and she remembered the pharmacy label. The label had Marlon's name, but it had a refill date from 2 months earlier. That meant Marlon had not been cut off from care, at least not entirely. It also meant someone was controlling her access in a way that looked normal on paper. Talia visited the pharmacy after her shift and spoke to a technician she knew from school. The technician said Kester picked up Marlon's meds most months, and he signed for them himself. He also asked for her records once, claiming insurance problems after a storm claim denial. That detail sounded like nothing, until Reeve connected it to his own job history. Reeve had inspected a roof on Kester's street the previous year and denied part of a claim. Reeve pulled his old claim notes and found a photo of the Vale house from that earlier visit. In the photo, the back window had bars that were not in the neighborhood norm. The report also mentioned smoke detectors missing, which could be another control tactic. Reeve realized Kester might have recognized him, then used the storm chaos to create leverage. The flood zone was not just danger, it was cover for a staged crisis. Reeve brought that information to detectives, along with his notebook and the official run sheet. He admitted he altered the chart, and he explained why he thought it mattered for safety. He said he feared the supervisor would bury the locked room detail, and he was partly right. Detectives requested the ambulance dash audio, and the unedited file included his spoken notes. That audio captured the bruising observation clearly, and it matched the timestamps. When the county finally released the raw radio file under legal pressure, the gap was obvious. Experts later said it looked like a manual edit, not a transmission drop. The supervisor was placed on leave, then later resigned before a formal hearing concluded. No one publicly called it a cover-up, but the paperwork language was careful and pointed. Reeve was disciplined for the protocol breach, but he kept his license after review. Kester was charged in a separate case, based on Marlin's statements and corroborating evidence. The storm did not cause the bruises, and it did not install a chain lock on a bedroom. Reeve's choice to enter the water was still a violation, and he accepted that fact. But his larger break from protocol was quieter, the choice to keep notes beyond the system. Those notes helped unwind what the storm tried to hide. Months later, Reeve returned to that same river road on a dry afternoon. The Vale house looked smaller in daylight, and the porch rail had been replaced. Reeve did not go up to the door, and he did not need to. He sat in his truck for a minute, then drove away, thinking about rules and reality. In the end, the storm was loud, but the real danger was the silence people edited in.